In the summer of 2019, a Fortune 500 company called Vantage Power Systems lost $43 million in a single quarter. Not to a bad investment, not to a market crash, not to fraud or mismanagement or any of the reasons companies usually bleed money in the dark. They lost it because their primary generator facility, a 200,000 square foot industrial complex in rural Ohio that powered the data infrastructure of 7 major American banks, 3 hospital networks, and 2 federal government contracts, kept shutting down, without warning, without explanation, without pattern. This is a great story that you need to grab a drink, sit comfortable to enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and like. Your comments too will go a long way. The CEO, a man named Richard Calloway, 61 years old, Stanford MBA, 3 decades of industry dominance, a man who had never once been described as someone who didn't have an answer, had hired 4 separate engineering firms to fix it. The first firm spent 11 weeks and $3 million and said the problem was in the cooling system. They replaced the cooling system. The facility shut down again 6 days later. The second firm spent 9 weeks and $4.2 million and said the problem was electromagnetic interference from nearby power lines. They installed new shielding. The facility shut down again in 11 days. The third firm, the most expensive, the most credentialed, the most recommended, spent 16 weeks, brought in equipment from Germany, and presented a 40-page report concluding the problem was a rare harmonic resonance issue in the transformer array. They rebuilt the transformer array from scratch. The facility shut down 3 days after they left. By the time Richard Calloway called the fourth firm, he had spent $18 million, lost $25 million more in contract penalties, and had begun for the first time in his professional life to wonder if there was something wrong with the building itself, something that no amount of engineering could fix. He told this to his assistant, Margaret, who had worked for him for 14 years and who was one of the very few people on Earth permitted to say things to him he didn't want to hear. She said, "Richard, you've hired the best people in the industry and none of them can fix it. Maybe the answer isn't in the industry." He stared at her. She said, "The janitor's kid has been asking questions about the generator room for 6 months. I think you should talk to him." Richard Calloway, Stanford MBA, 3 decades of dominance, $43 million in the hole, almost said no. He almost missed everything. This is the story of what happened when he didn't. Part 1. The company and the man. Before we can understand what Marcus Webb did in that generator room, we need to understand what kind of man Richard Calloway was. Because Richard Calloway was not a villain. This is important to say because stories like this one are often told with a villain, the arrogant rich man, the dismissive executive, the powerful person who looks down on the humble. And while Richard did dismiss Marcus Webb for longer than he should have, calling him a villain would be lazy and inaccurate and would miss the more interesting, more human truth. Richard Calloway was a man who had been shaped entirely and specifically by a system that rewarded credentials. He had grown up in Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker father and a school secretary mother. He had been smart, genuinely unusually smart, and he had understood from an early age that intelligence was a door, but credentials were the key. You could be the smartest person in the room, but without the right letters after your name, the room wouldn't open for you. So he had gotten the letters. He had earned a scholarship to Ohio State for undergraduate, worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't, graduated with honors in electrical engineering, won a partial scholarship to Stanford for his MBA, graduated second in his class, and walked directly into a job at a major energy infrastructure company where he had spent the next 20 years climbing steadily and relentlessly until he reached the top. He had built Vantage Power Systems from a mid-sized contractor into a nationally significant infrastructure company. He had done it through intelligence, through work ethic, and through a rigorous belief in process, in the idea that complex problems had structured solutions and that the people most qualified to find those solutions were the people with the most relevant training and credentials. This belief had served him extraordinarily well, until the summer of 2019. By that summer, Vantage's Ohio facility, which they called the Meridian Complex, had become the company's crown jewel. It housed 12 industrial generators that together produced enough power to serve as the primary backup infrastructure for clients across 4 states. When those clients' primary power sources failed, storms, grid issues, cyber attacks, Vantage's generators were what kept the hospital operating rooms running and the bank servers online and the federal databases accessible. It was, in the language of the industry, critical infrastructure. And it had been behaving for 8 months like a haunted house. The first shutdown happened on November 3, 2018. It was a Tuesday. No storm, no unusual grid activity, no scheduled maintenance. At 2:17 in the afternoon, all 12 generators in the Meridian complex shut down simultaneously. Not sequentially, not in a cascade failure, but together at the same moment, as if someone had thrown a single switch. They came back online 14 minutes later, also simultaneously. The on-site engineers ran every diagnostic they had. They found nothing. The generators were operating within normal parameters. The shutdown had left no trace in the system logs that any of the monitoring software could interpret. They called it a ghost fault. They wrote it up, they flagged it for monitoring. It happened again 18 days later, and again 22 days after that. Always simultaneous, always brief, between 12 and 20 minutes, always leaving no trace in the logs that standard diagnostic tools could read. And always, this was the detail that nobody could explain. Always between the hours of 2 and 4 p.m. The pattern was consistent enough to be terrifying and inconsistent enough to prevent any clear diagnosis. Sometimes it happened on a Tuesday, sometimes a Thursday, sometimes it skipped 3 weeks. Once it happened twice in the same week, but it was always afternoon, always 2 to 4 p.m., always 12 generators, all at once. By February 2019, the contract penalties were accumulating. 3 of Vantage's major clients had invoked performance clauses. Richard had deployed his own engineering team, 20 people, some of the best technical minds in the company, and they had found nothing that satisfied them. That was when he called the first outside firm. You already know how that went. What you don't know yet, what Richard himself didn't fully grasp until much later, was that every single engineering firm he hired made the same fundamental mistake. They all looked at the generators. Marcus Webb was 19 years old in the summer of 2019. He was not enrolled in college. He did not have an engineering degree or any credential of any kind that the industry Richard Calloway operated in would have recognized as meaningful. What Marcus had was a father named Delroy Webb, who had worked as a janitor at the Meridian complex for 11 years, and a mind that had been, since he was approximately 4 years old, constitutionally incapable of encountering a system without needing to understand exactly how it worked. Delroy Webb was a quiet, careful man who took profound pride in work that most people considered invisible. He kept the Meridian complex spotless, not because he was required to, but because he believed that the physical environment of a workplace expressed something about the values of the people in it. And he had decided, 11 years ago, to express something good. The engineers respected him. The executives were friendly to him in the way that executives are friendly to people who are not in their mental category of person. Richard Calloway had spoken to Delroy perhaps 6 times in 11 years. Marcus had started coming to the facility on school holidays when he was around 12. Delroy would bring him in on Saturdays, let him help with cleaning, use the time to talk to his son about the value of honest work and the dignity of any job done well. But Marcus had also spent those Saturdays looking at the generators. Not with any particular plan, not with any credential or authority, just looking. Because they were the most interesting things he had ever seen. 12 massive industrial generators, each one the size of a small house, each one a system of extraordinary complexity. He asked his father questions, and when his father didn't know the answers, he asked the engineers, and most of them were kind enough to answer, partly because they liked Delroy, and partly because the quality of Marcus's questions was unusual enough to be interesting. By the time he was 16, he understood the basic operating principles of industrial generators better than some first-year engineering graduates. By the time he was 18, He had taught himself, through the combination of library books and internet research and a second-hand textbook on electrical systems he had found at a garage sale, a significant amount of what an electrical engineering program would have taught him in 2 years. He was not a genius in the Hollywood sense. He didn't have a photographic memory or a superhuman gift. He was simply a young man with a specific, deep, almost obsessive interest in how things worked. And he had been looking at the same 12 generators for 7 years when they started to malfunction. He noticed something within the first 2 weeks of the shutdowns. It took him 6 months to be sure enough about it to say something to anyone. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you have not. Don't forget to comment where you are coming from. What Marcus noticed was not in the generators. It was in the building. Specifically, it was in the east wing of the building, a long corridor that ran parallel to the main generator floor, used primarily for equipment storage and as a route between the generator floor and the facility's administrative offices. This corridor was, on most days, unremarkable. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, metal shelving units loaded with spare parts and maintenance supplies. But Marcus had been walking that corridor for 7 years, and he had noticed, in the months before the shutdowns began, that something had changed. The storage pattern had changed. In the spring of 2018, approximately 6 months before the first shutdown, the facility had undergone a routine reorganization of its storage systems. New metal shelving units had been installed in the east corridor, larger ones, installed by an outside contractor on a Tuesday in April, taken as a routine maintenance job that nobody logged in any special way. The new shelving units were made of a different grade of steel than the old ones, higher ferrous content, and they were placed approximately 3 meters closer to the generator floor wall than the previous units had been. Marcus had not initially known what this meant. He had just noticed it, filed it in the way he filed everything, as a fact about the system waiting for a context that would make it meaningful. The context arrived when the shutdowns began. He started paying attention to the specifics. He stood in the corridor during a shutdown. His father was on shift, so Marcus was in the building, and he felt it before he understood it. A faint vibration in the corridor wall, not from the generators failing, from something else. Something that seemed to move through the building in a way that the generators were reacting to, not causing. He went home that evening and began reading about electromagnetic fields and ferrous metals and harmonic interference. 3 weeks later, he read a paper, a dense, technical paper published in an obscure engineering journal in 2011, written by a Norwegian researcher named Dr. Ingrid Solberg, about a phenomenon called induced resonance amplification in industrial environments with high-density ferrous storage near operating electromagnetic systems. He read it 4 times. Then he sat very still for a long time. Then he went to talk to his father. Delroy Webb was a man who understood the world he lived in with a clarity that was sometimes painful. He understood specifically that there was a version of this situation that went very badly for his family. His son, 19, no college degree, no credentials, approaching a 61-year-old CEO with a Stanford MBA, whose company had just spent $18 million on the problem, to say, "I think I know what's wrong." Delroy had seen what happened to people who didn't know their lane. He had spent 11 years being good at a job that people looked through him to see, and he had made peace with that, and he had built a life with his wife Janet that was stable and dignified and good. He was not going to risk that stability by having his teenage son walk into Richard Calloway's office with a theory. "Marcus," he said, "these are engineers, credentialed engineers, multiple firms." "I know, Dad. And you're telling me they all missed something that you found?" "I'm telling you I think I found something they missed because they were all looking in the wrong place, which is actually a really easy mistake to make. The symptoms point at the generators, so everyone looked at the generators. And you looked somewhere else. I looked at the whole building because that's what I do when I'm here. I walk around and look at everything." Delroy was quiet for a long time. "If you're wrong," he said, finally, "they'll think you're a kid who got too big for his britches, and they'll look at me differently." Marcus nodded. He had thought about this. "And if I'm right," he said, "they saved the company and their clients And $43 million. Dad, I've been looking at this for 6 months. I'm not wrong. Another silence. How sure are you? Delroy asked. Sure enough that I can't sleep. Sure enough that I keep thinking about the hospitals. It was the hospitals that did it. Delroy Webb had spent 11 years mopping floors in a building that kept hospital operating rooms running. He knew, in a way that was not abstract, what happened when the backup power failed. He never met any of the patients. He would never meet them. But they were there, somewhere on the other side of the electrical current his building produced, and they were real. He picked up his phone. He called Margaret, Richard Calloway's assistant, whom he had known for 9 years and who has always been straightforward with him. Margaret, he said, my son has something he needs to tell Mr. Calloway. I need you to hear me when I say, please make sure he gets the meeting. Richard Calloway agreed to the meeting with the energy of a man doing a favor he didn't think he needed to do. Margaret had been insistent enough that he took it seriously as a courtesy rather than a genuine possibility. He had scheduled 30 minutes. He had assumed he would spend most of it letting a teenager with too much confidence down gently, perhaps offering some kind of internship referral as a consolation. Marcus Webb walked into the conference room in a clean button-down shirt that his mother had ironed that morning, carrying a manila folder and a second-hand laptop, and he sat down across from one of the most powerful men in the American energy infrastructure industry. He was not nervous. This surprised Richard considerably. He had expected nerves, the trembling quality of someone who knew they were out of their depth and was trying to hide it. He had not expected the quality that Marcus actually had, which was the stillness of someone who had done the work, knew what the work had produced, and was simply here to share it. Mr. Calloway, Marcus said, I want to start by saying that the engineering firms you hired were excellent. The reason they didn't solve the problem isn't because they're bad at their jobs, it's because the problem is in a place none of them thought to look. Richard said nothing. He was already, despite himself, paying attention. Marcus opened the folder. He had printed the key pages from Dr. Solberg's 2011 paper. He had drawn a hand-drawn diagram of the East Corridor, showing the placement of the old shelving units versus the new ones. He had a timeline, dates, shutdown durations, and analysis of the 2 to 4 p.m. window. He laid it out in 17 minutes. The East Corridor's new shelving units, high ferrous steel, positioned closer to the generator floor wall, were creating a concentrated ferrous mass at a specific point in the building's structure. The generators, operating at full capacity in the early afternoon when client demand was highest, produced a particular electromagnetic field that, when interacting with that concentrated ferrous mass, generated a resonance frequency. That frequency was conducted through the building's structural steel, which was old, pre-code, and had a specific conductive property that the newer buildings would not have.
Vibration reading on unit 4 is high.
Into the generator control systems.
Let me check the history.
Not the generators
We should inspect
themselves,
the bearings
the control
regardless.
systems, the microprocessors that monitored generator performance and made automatic protective shutdowns when readings fell outside normal parameters. The resonance was producing false readings. The control systems, responding to what they believed were dangerous anomalies, were shutting the generators down as a protective measure. There was nothing wrong with the generators. There was nothing wrong with the cooling system, or the transformer array, or the electromagnetic shielding. There was a stack of shelving units in a corridor, made of the wrong kind of steel, sitting in the wrong place, talking to a 70-year-old building in a language that nobody had thought to listen for. The solution was either to move the shelving units, cost 1 afternoon of labor, or to install ferromagnetic shielding on the specific section of corridor wall adjacent to the generator control systems. Cost of shielding, approximately $14,000. Richard Calloway had spent $18 million not solving this. He sat across from a 19-year-old with a manila folder for a long moment. Then he said, How did you find the Solberg paper? Google Scholar, Marcus said, and then I had to get a library card to access the full journal. Another silence. "You have a library card?" Richard said. "Yes, sir." "For an engineering journal?" It was the only way to read it for free. Richard looked at the diagram. He looked at the timeline. He looked at the 17-year-old paper by a Norwegian researcher that 4 engineering firms, collectively representing hundreds of credentialed experts, had not found. "If we do what you're proposing," he said carefully, "and it doesn't work, then you've spent $14,000 in one afternoon, which is less than you spent last Tuesday." Richard did not immediately greenlight Marcus's solution. This is the part of the story where some people lose patience with Richard, and where I want to ask for a moment of fairness. He was the CEO of a company with federal contracts and hospital network agreements. He could not, in good conscience, implement a structural change to a critical infrastructure facility based on the recommendation of an uncredentialed teenager without any independent verification, regardless of how compelling the teenager's logic was. What he did was call Dr. Sarah Okonkwo. Dr. Okonkwo was a professor of electrical engineering at Carnegie Mellon University and one of the foremost experts in electromagnetic systems in the country. She had consulted on government infrastructure projects. She had published more papers than most people read in a lifetime. She was Richard's version of a second opinion that he trusted completely. He sent Marcus's folder, the diagram, the timeline, the Solberg paper, the analysis, with a cover note that said only, "Tell me if this kid is right." Dr. Okonkwo called back in 4 hours. She said, "Richard, I need to know who did this analysis." He told her. There was a silence on the phone that Richard later described as the most interesting silence of his professional life. She said, "He's right. Not approximately right, precisely, specifically, technically right. He identified an induced resonance amplification pattern that I would estimate fewer than 200 engineers in this country would know to look for. And he's 19 and he learned it from a library card." Another pause. "Implement his solution, and then I'd like his contact information."
And here is where the story changes. Because everything up to this point, the brilliant young man, the overlooked genius, the CEO who almost missed it, is a good story, a satisfying story, the kind of story that confirms what we want to believe about hidden talent and unrecognized potential. But it's not the real story. The real story is what happened in the week between Marcus's meeting with Richard and the implementation of the fix. What happened was that Richard Calloway, in the course of verifying Marcus's analysis, pulled the full maintenance and access logs for the Meridian complex going back 3 years. He was looking for the date the shelving units were installed, confirming the timeline. He found the date, April 16, 2018, confirmed by the contractor invoice. And then, 3 lines below it in the log, he found something that made him stop. A maintenance note, dated April 18, 2018, 2 days after the shelving installation. The note read, "Potential interference concern with East Corridor storage configuration. Recommend engineering review before full generator season begins. Flag for follow-up." The note had been filed by a maintenance staff member. The maintenance staff member's employee ID was D0047. Richard pulled the employee file for D0047. Delroy Webb, janitor, 11 years of service. Delroy Webb had flagged the potential problem 2 days after the shelving was installed, 14 months before the first shutdown, a year and a half before the company started hemorrhaging money. The flag had been received by the Facilities Management Department, logged as a low-priority maintenance concern, and buried. Not maliciously, there was no villain here, remember, but in the ordinary, grinding way that important information gets buried in large organizations when it arrives without credentials attached to it. A janitor had flagged it. The Facilities Department had received it. Nobody in the decision-making chain had read it. Because why would a janitor know something that engineers didn't? Richard sat in his office with this document for a very long time. He thought about 11 years, about $43 million, about 4 engineering firms and their combined hundreds of credentials and their combined $18 million in fees. He thought about a man who mopped floors and noticed things and filed a report that nobody read. He thought about what it meant that both the father and the son had seen what nobody else had seen, and that the father had tried to tell someone a year and a half before the crisis, and that the system he had built had been so perfectly structured to ignore certain kinds of knowledge that it had swallowed the warning whole and produced no response. He thought about how many other Delroy Webbs were in his company. How many maintenance notes, filed by people without the right letters after their names, were sitting in how many low-priority queues, waiting for a crisis that didn't have to happen? He thought about the hospitals. The shelving units were moved on a Wednesday afternoon. 4 men, 3 hours, $0 in equipment cost. The Meridian complex did not shut down again. Not that week, not that month, not in the 4 years since. The facility has operated with a reliability rating that has become, somewhat quietly, the highest in the industry. Marcus Webb was offered a job at Vantage Power Systems, not a junior position, not a token gesture, a real engineering analyst role with a title that reflected what he actually did and a salary that Richard later said he was somewhat embarrassed it had taken a crisis to offer. Marcus accepted. He enrolled in a part-time engineering degree program sponsored by the company while working full-time. He currently holds 3 patents related to electromagnetic interference detection in industrial settings. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo has co-authored 2 papers with him. He is 24 years old. But here is what Richard Calloway did that doesn't usually make it into the version of this story that gets shared, the part that matters more in some ways than the generator fix. He called a company-wide meeting, all facilities, all departments, every level of the organization from executive to maintenance. He stood up and told the story of the maintenance note, the full story, Delroy Webb's name included, the timeline, the $43 million, the 4 firms, the library card. And then he said, "We almost lost this company because we built a system that was very good at listening to people with credentials and very bad at listening to everyone else. I did that. I built it that way because I believed in credentials, and credentials matter. I'm not saying they don't, but the most important information about what was wrong with our building came from a janitor who filed a note and a teenager who got a library card. And our system was designed in every practical sense to ignore both of them." He paused. He said, "That's over." Vantage Power Systems redesigned its internal flagging and review system to ensure that maintenance and facilities observations, regardless of who filed them, were reviewed by a rotating engineering committee within 72 hours. They called it the Webb Protocol. Delroy Webb, who had been a janitor for 11 years and once filed a report that nobody read, was promoted to Senior Facilities Intelligence Officer, a new role created specifically to formalize and amplify the kind of observational knowledge that people like him carry, but that organizations almost never know how to receive. He accepted with a dignity that Richard said in an interview he gave 3 years later, he has tried to deserve every day since. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, and share. There are more interesting stories coming up, and there are more on the channels currently. There's a management theory, very old, very well documented, very consistently ignored, called the principle of peripheral knowledge. It holds that in any complex system, the people closest to the physical reality of that system, the ones touching it, cleaning it, walking past it every day, accumulate a form of knowledge that is invisible to the people managing it from above, and that this knowledge is frequently the most operationally important knowledge in the entire organization.
Hospitals have known this for decades. The best hospitals in the world have formal systems for collecting the observations of nurses, orderlies, and cleaning staff because they have learned repeatedly and painfully that these are the people who notice the patient's color changing before the monitors do. Airlines know it. The near miss that doesn't become a crash is often prevented by a ground crew member who noticed something and had a system to report it quickly to someone who could act on it. The military has entire doctrines built around it. And yet, in most companies, in most organizations of most kinds, the Delroy Webbs of the world file their maintenance notes into systems that are designed, in every practical sense, to receive them and then do nothing with them. Not because anyone decided to ignore janitors. Nobody sat down and said, "We don't listen to the people without degrees." It happens structurally, incrementally, through 1,000 small organizational decisions that each seem reasonable and that together produce a machine for filtering out certain kinds of knowing. Richard Calloway built that machine, and then he had the unusual courage, rarer than you would think in a person of his position, to dismantle it publicly, at cost to his own ego, in front of his entire company. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost. The generator fix is satisfying. The brilliant kid is inspiring. But the CEO who stood up in front of everyone and said, "I built something that nearly destroyed us, and here is exactly how, and here is what I'm going to do about it," that is the rarer thing. That is arguably the more impressive act. Marcus Webb still has the library card. He keeps it in his wallet, behind his Vantage Power Systems ID, behind his engineering credentials, behind everything that the world now uses to measure his worth. His father asked him once why he kept it. "Because," Marcus said, "the day I got that library card, nobody thought I had any business solving a $43 million problem. The card is the proof that you don't need permission to learn. You just need to want to know how things work." His father was quiet for a moment. "I filed that maintenance note in April of 2018. You know that, right? I saw it too." "I know, Dad," Marcus said. "And nobody read it." "I know." "So what does that mean?" Marcus thought about this for a moment. "It means," he said, "that knowing something isn't enough. You have to be in a room where what you know is worth something. And if you're not in that room, you build your way into it, or you raise someone who does." Delroy Webb looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "Go home, Marcus. Your mother made jollof." And that was the end of the conversation. The Meridian complex is still running. All 12 generators, no shutdowns, no ghost faults, no $43 million quarters, just a building doing its job, keeping the hospital operating rooms running and the bank servers online and the federal databases accessible because a 19-year-old got a library card and because his father noticed something first. We spend a lot of time in this world asking who the smartest person in the room is. We spend a lot less time asking who we've designed the room to exclude. The Meridian complex didn't need a better engineering firm. It needed someone who walked its corridors for 7 years because he came to keep his father company, and who looked at the same shelving units every Saturday for 6 months because looking at things was simply what he did. It needed someone who couldn't afford the journal but could afford the library card. It needed someone who noticed. The world is full of people who notice. Most of them are never asked. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, and share. There are more interesting stories coming up, and there are more on the channels currently.